I stood in the middle of our new living room, the smell of fresh paint still lingering in the air, and felt a rush of pride wash over me. Alyssa and I had just tied the knot, and this little house in a quiet Denver suburb was ours, a fresh start, a place to build our life together. It wasn't much, just a modest 3-bedroom with a small yard, but it was perfect for us. The hardwood floors creaked under my boots as I carried the last box inside, and I could already picture us here, maybe a kid or two down the line, a dog chasing its tail in the backyard. I was grinning like an idiot, thinking about how lucky I was to have her as my wife. Alyssa was in the kitchen, humming some tune I didn't recognize, unpacking dishes we'd gotten as wedding gifts. Everything felt right, like the world had finally lined up for me. But that bubble burst faster than I expected. It hadn't even been a full week since we moved in when I heard a car pull into the driveway. I peeked out the window and saw Diane and Harold, Alyssa's parents, climbing out of their old sedan. My stomach tightened a little. They hadn't called, hadn't texted, just showed up like they owned the place. I opened the door before they could knock, trying to keep things friendly. "Hey, good to see you," I said, forcing a smile. Diane brushed past me without a word, her eyes scanning the house like she was checking for code violations. Harold followed, grunting a hello, his bushy eyebrows furrowed as he sized up the furniture we'd picked out together. They stayed longer than I wanted, poking around, asking questions I didn't feel like answering. Diane kept saying how the curtains were too thin, how the kitchen needed better lighting. Harold just nodded along, muttering about how the neighborhood wasn't as safe as it looked. I bit my tongue, figuring they were just being overprotective. Alyssa seemed happy to see them, chatting away like it was normal for them to barge in. Then, as they were getting ready to leave, Diane turned to Alyssa with this sharp little smile and said, "We need a spare key. You know, just to check in whenever we want." My jaw tightened, but before I could say anything, Alyssa was nodding, digging through a drawer, and handing over the extra key we'd made. Just like that. No discussion, no glance my way. Diane pocketed it, and Harold clapped me on the shoulder like we'd all agreed to some great plan. "Good to know we can keep an eye on things," he said, and they walked out. I stood there, staring at the closed door, feeling something sour twist in my gut. This wasn't just a visit, it was them staking a claim. Alyssa came up behind me, slipping her arms around my waist, all soft and warm. "They're just worried about us," she said, her voice light, like it was no big deal. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to think it was nothing. But as I turned to look at her, smiling that sweet smile I'd fallen for, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. They had a key now. They could walk in whenever they felt like it. Our house, our life, suddenly didn't feel as ours anymore. I hugged her back, kissing the top of her head, but my mind was already racing. I wasn't going to let this slide, not for long. This was our home, and I'd be damned if I let anyone, even her parents, treat it like their personal playground. Something had to change, and I was already starting to figure out how to make that happen. The rest of the day, I kept busy unpacking, hammering nails into the wall for pictures, anything to keep my hands moving while my brain churned. Alyssa didn't notice the shift in me. She was too caught up in her own little world, talking about where the couch should go, what color we should paint the bedroom. I nodded along, but every time I glanced at the front door, I pictured that key in Diane's purse. I kept telling myself I was overreacting. They were her parents, not some strangers off the street. Maybe they'd never even use it. But deep down, I knew better. I'd seen how they hovered over Alyssa her whole life, how they always had an opinion on everything she did. Now they had a way in, and I wasn't naive enough to think they'd stay out. By the time we went to bed that night, I was lying awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to Alyssa's soft breathing beside me. This was supposed to be our fresh start, our happy beginning. Instead, it felt like someone had just drawn a line in the sand, and I was already figuring out how to push back. I woke up the next morning with that sour feeling still gnawing at me, but I didn't let it show. Alyssa was already in the kitchen, pouring coffee into mismatched mugs, her hair a mess from sleep. She looked so happy, so carefree, and I didn't want to ruin it. So I smiled. I took the mug she handed me, kissed her cheek, and acted like everything was fine. "You sleep okay?" she asked, leaning against the counter. Like a rock, I lied, sipping the coffee. It burned my tongue, but I didn't care. I needed to keep my head clear, because inside, something had shifted. That key in Diane's hands wasn't just a piece of metal, it was a signal. I'd seen the way her parents operated before we got married, always hovering around Alyssa, always sticking their noses where they didn't belong. This wasn't a one-time thing. This was them setting up camp in our life, and I wasn't about to let it happen. I kept the smile plastered on my face all morning, nodding as Alyssa talked about her plans for the day, grocery shopping, maybe planting some flowers in the front yard. She didn't suspect a thing, and I didn't want her to. Not yet. If I brought it up now, she'd just say I was being paranoid, that her parents meant well. Maybe they did, in their own twisted way, but I wasn't buying it. That key was their way of saying they didn't trust me to take care of her, that they still had control. I wasn't going to argue with Alyssa about it, though. Not when she was still glowing from the wedding, still caught up in the fairy tale of us. Instead, I decided to handle it my way. Quietly. Smartly. If they wanted to play this game, I'd play it better. After Alyssa left for the store, I got to work. First thing I did was head to the hardware store down the street. The guy behind the counter barely looked up as I grabbed what I needed, a hotel-style deadbolt, the kind with a keypad you can change whenever you want. No key. No problem. I picked up a couple of motion-activated cameras too, small ones I could tuck into corners where nobody would notice. I wasn't messing around. If Diane and Harold thought they could waltz in whenever they felt like it, they were about to learn they didn't know me as well as they thought. Back home, I installed the deadbolt myself, sweating through my shirt as I drilled it into the door frame. It felt good, taking control like that. The cameras went up next, one in the living room, one by the back door. I linked into my phone, testing the app until I was sure they'd catch anything that moved. Every time I tightened a screw or punched in the code, I felt a little more like this house was mine again. But I wasn't done. I needed backup, someone who'd have my back no matter what. So I made a call to Uncle Ray. He picked up on the second ring, his gravelly voice cutting through the line. "Hey, kid, what's up?" I could hear the hum of his tattoo gun in the background. He was probably at his shop, inking some biker's arm. Uncle Ray was my mom's younger brother, a big guy with a shaved head, tattoos crawling up his neck, and a stare that could make anyone think twice. He'd been around the block, done some wild stuff in his biker days, but he was family, loyal to a fault. I told him everything. The in-laws showing up, the key, the way they acted like they owned us. He didn't say much, just listened, grunting every now and then. When I finished, he chuckled, low and rough. "Sounds like they need a wake-up call. You want me to swing by?" I didn't hesitate. "Yeah, Ray. I'd owe you one." He didn't ask for details, just said, "Give me a day or two," and hung up. By the time Alyssa got home, the house looked the same on the outside, no sign of the new lock or the cameras unless you knew where to look. She dropped the grocery bags on the counter, chatting about how she'd found a sale on chicken, and I helped her unpack, keeping my tone light. "Looks like we're eating good tonight," I said, grinning as I stacked cans in the pantry. She didn't notice the deadbolt when she locked the door later, didn't ask why I was checking my phone more than usual. Good. I wasn't hiding it from her. Not really, just waiting for the right moment to explain. If Diane and Harold stayed away, maybe she'd never need to know. But I wasn't holding my breath. They'd be back, and when they came, I'd be ready. Uncle Ray was coming. The locks were set. The cameras were live. I wasn't just smiling anymore. I was planning. This was our house, our life, and I was drawing a line they wouldn't cross without a fight. Let them try. I'd be waiting. I was sitting at my desk at work, staring at a spreadsheet that wouldn't balance, when my phone buzzed hard against the wood. I glanced at the screen, motion detected in the living room. My heart kicked up a notch. It had only been a week since I set up the cameras, and I figured it might be Alyssa moving around, maybe rearranging furniture like she'd been talking about. But she was supposed to be at her yoga class. I tapped the app, pulling up the live feed, and there they were, Diane and Harold, strolling through my house like it was their Sunday open house tour. My jaw clenched so tight I thought my teeth might crack. Diane was folding a blanket on the couch, her lips pursed like she didn't approve of how we'd left it. Harold was over by the desk, flipping through a stack of mail I hadn't opened yet. I couldn't believe it. They'd used the key. Already. I leaned closer to the screen, my hands shaking a little as I watched. Harold moved to the kitchen, opening drawers, poking around like he was looking for something. Diane started wiping down the coffee table with a rag she must have brought with her. Ours were still in a box somewhere. It wasn't just that they were there. It was how comfortable they looked, how entitled. My blood ran cold, then hot, a slow burn creeping up my neck. This wasn't their house. They didn't get to decide how we lived, what we did, where our stuff went. I grabbed my keys and stood up, muttering something to my boss about a family emergency. I didn't wait for his nod, just bolted for the parking lot, my truck roaring to life as I peeled out toward home. The whole drive, I kept checking the feed. They were still there, oblivious to the cameras. I wondered if they'd even care if they knew I was watching. Probably not. They'd probably say it was their right, that they were helping us. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles white. I'd known they were pushy, but this? Walking in unannounced, treating our place like an extension of their own? It was too much. I thought about calling Alyssa, warning her, but I didn't. She'd just tell me to calm down, that they didn't mean any harm. I wasn't in the mood to hear it. This was my call now, and I was going to handle it. When I got close to the house, I slowed down, parking a block away so they wouldn't hear the engine. My phone buzzed again, another alert. I checked it and saw them heading for the door, Diane with a smug little smile, Harold jingling the key like some kind of trophy. They turned the knob, pushed, then stopped. Diane frowned, trying again. Harold gave it a shove. Nothing. The deadbolt held firm, the keypad blinking red. They were locked in. I almost laughed, picturing their confusion, but I kept moving, slipping around to the back. That's when I heard the basement door creak open, slow and heavy. Boots thudded on the stairs, and out stepped Uncle Ray, right on cue. He filled the doorway like a wall, arms crossed over his broad chest, the tattoos on his neck catching the light. "What do we have here?" he said, his voice low and rough, like gravel under tires. Diane let out a yelp, clutching her chest like she'd seen a ghost. Harold spun around, puffing up his skinny frame, his face going red. "Who the hell are you?" he snapped, pointing a shaky finger. Ray didn't flinch, just grinned, showing teeth. "Friend of the family," he said, stepping closer. "And you're trespassing." Harold sputtered. "Trespassing? This is my daughter's house." Ray tilted his head, looking him up and down like he was sizing up a bug. "Funny. I don't see her here. Just two clowns who don't know when to quit." I reached the back door then, slipping inside just as Diane started shrieking at Ray. "You have no right." "We have a key," she yelled, waving it in the air. Ray didn't budge, just leaned against the wall, cool as ice. "He don't mean much when the lock's changed," he said. That's when I stepped into the room, my boots loud on the floor. Diane's eyes snapped to me, wide and furious. Harold turned, his mouth opening like he had something clever to say, but I cut him off. "What are you doing in my house?" I asked, keeping my voice steady, though I wanted to shout. Diane blinked, thrown off. We were just checking on things," she stammered. Harold nodded, crossing his arms. "Making sure you're taking care of Alyssa." I stared at them, feeling the weight of it all, their nerve, their excuses, their total disregard for us. "You don't get to decide that," I said, stepping closer. "This is our home, not yours." Ray chuckled behind me, a dark little sound that made Harold flinch. Diane's face twisted, like she couldn't believe I'd talked to her that way. "Alyssa gave us the key," she shot back, clutching it tighter. "Yeah," I said, nodding. "And I'm telling you to leave." They didn't move, just stood there, glaring, until Ray straightened up, cracking his knuckles. That got them shuffling toward the door, muttering under their breath. I watched them fumble with the deadbolt, trapped by their own stupidity, and felt a grim kind of satisfaction. This was just the start. They'd crossed a line, and I wasn't letting it go. I stood in the kitchen, watching Diane and Harold squirm as they realized they couldn't get out. The deadbolt's red light blinked at them, mocking their every push and pull on the door. My chest felt tight with a mix of anger and something close to triumph. They'd walked in here thinking they could do whatever they wanted, and now they were stuck, caged in by their own arrogance. Uncle Ray loomed behind them, his shadow stretching across the living room floor, making the whole scene feel like something out of a movie I'd watch late at night. He didn't say much, just stood there with that grin of his, arms crossed, letting them stew. Diane's face was pale, her hands fluttering like she didn't know what to do with them. Harold kept yanking at the doorknob, his breathing loud and ragged, like a bull about to charge. "You can't do this." Harold finally barked, spinning around to face Ray. His voice cracked a little, betraying the bravado he was trying to sell. "This is illegal. We'll call the police." Ray didn't even blink. He reached into his back pocket, slow and deliberate, and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Go ahead," he said, his tone flat. "Call him. See what they say about this." He unfolded it and held it up, a signed sublease agreement, neat and official, with my signature and his scrawled at the bottom. I'd called the property management company a couple days ago, worked it all out. For this week, the house was legally sublet to Ray. It was a loophole, sure, but it was airtight. Their key didn't mean a damn thing anymore. Diane snatched the paper from his hand, her eyes darting over the words like she could will them to disappear. What is this nonsense? She snapped, her voice shrill. This is Alyssa's house. Harold leaned over her shoulder, reading it too, his face turning a shade of purple I'd never seen before. You're trespassing, he said again, jabbing a finger at Ray. You don't belong here. Ray laughed, a short, harsh sound that made Diane flinch. Read it again, pal, he said. I'm the tenant this week. You're the ones who don't belong. He took a step closer, towering over them, and I swear I saw Harold shrink a little. So how about you sit down and wait till we figure this out, huh? That's when I walked in from the kitchen, my boots thudding on the hardwood. Diane's head whipped around, and the look she gave me could have burned a hole through steel. You, she hissed, like I'd betrayed some sacred trust. You let this happen? Harold turned too, his mouth twisting into a sneer. What kind of man pulls a stunt like this? He growled. I didn't flinch, just met their stares head on. The kind who doesn't let people walk all over him, I said, keeping my voice calm but hard. You came in here without asking. You went through our stuff. What kind of people do that? Diane opened her mouth, then closed it, her cheeks flushing. Harold sputtered. We were helping. You wouldn't understand. I understand plenty, I cut him off, stepping closer. You think you can just show up, take over, because you've got a key? That stops now. Ray moved beside me, a solid wall of muscle and ink, and I felt stronger with him there. Diane clutched the sublease, crumpling it in her fist. This is ridiculous, she said, her voice shaking. We're Alyssa's parents. We have every right. No, I said, sharp enough to make her stop. You don't. This is our house, not yours. And right now, it's Ray's. So you're gonna leave, and you're not coming back unless we say so. Harold puffed up again, like he was about to argue, but Ray cracked his neck, loud and slow, and that seemed to suck the fight right out of him. Diane looked between us, her eyes wild, then grabbed Harold's arm. Let's go, she muttered, pulling him toward the door. I punched in the code, the deadbolt clicked open, and they stumbled out, Diane still clutching that crumpled paper like it was evidence. I watched them march down the driveway, Harold muttering curses, Diane throwing glares back at me. The second they were gone, I locked the door again, feeling the weight lift off my shoulders. Ray clapped me on the back, his hand heavy. Nice work, kid, he said, grinning. They won't forget that. I nodded, catching my breath. Thanks for being here, Ray. I owe you. He shrugged, heading for the fridge like he owned the place, which, for now, he kind of did. Family's family, he said, cracking open a beer he'd brought. Besides, that was fun. I laughed, a real one this time, and grabbed a beer of my own. We sat there in the living room, the same room they'd invaded, and it felt different now. Ours again, at least for a minute. I knew Alyssa would be home soon, and I'd have to tell her what happened. She wouldn't like it, wouldn't get why I'd gone this far. But I couldn't let it slide. Diane and Harold thought they could run our lives, and I'd just shown them they were wrong. Ray raised his bottle, and I clinked mine against it. To keeping what's ours, he said. I nodded. This was just the beginning, and I was ready for whatever came next. I leaned against the kitchen counter, sipping the beer Ray had handed me, still buzzing from the showdown. The house felt quiet now, almost too quiet, like it was holding its breath after Diane and Harold stormed out. Ray was sprawled on the couch, flipping through channels on the TV, acting like nothing had happened. But my mind was racing. Alyssa would be home any minute, and I knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The front door creaked open right on cue, and there she was, her yoga bag slung over her shoulder, her face bright until she saw Ray. Then me. Then the tension hanging in the air like smoke. What's going on? She asked, her voice soft but sharp, like she could already tell something was wrong. I set the beer down, wiping my hands on my jeans, trying to figure out how to start. Your parents stopped by, I said, keeping it simple. Her eyes widened a little, and she dropped her bag by the door. Oh, did they say why? She asked, stepping closer. I took a deep breath, glancing at Ray, who just raised an eyebrow and kept his mouth shut. They didn't say anything, I told her. They just let themselves in. With the key. Her face shifted, confusion first, then a flicker of worry. What do you mean, let themselves in? She asked, her voice rising. I pulled out my phone, opened the camera app, and showed her the footage, Diane folding blankets, Harold digging through our mail. Her hand went to her mouth, and for a second, I thought she'd get it, see why I'd done what I did. But then the door flew open again, and there they were, Diane and Harold, back like a bad dream. Diane's eyes were red, Her face twisted with fury, and Harold looked ready to explode. "You let this happen?" Diane shrieked, pointing at Alyssa like she'd been betrayed. "You let him do this to us?" Alyssa froze, caught between me and them, her head whipping back and forth. "What's she talking about?" she asked me, her voice shaking. I stepped forward, keeping calm even though my pulse was hammering. "They came in uninvited," I said. "I locked them in with the new deadbolt. Ray was here, legally, thanks to the sublease. They're mad because they got caught." Diane didn't let me finish. "Caught?" she snapped, her voice so loud it echoed off the walls. "We were helping. We were making sure this place wasn't a mess. And you turned it into some kind of trap." Harold jumped in, his fists clenched. "This is insane. Locking us in like criminals. Who do you think you are?" I met his glare, not backing down. "I'm the guy who lives here," I said. "You don't get to walk in whenever you want. That key doesn't give you a free pass." Alyssa grabbed my arm, her fingers digging in. "You locked them in?" she whispered, like she couldn't believe it. I nodded, holding her gaze. "Yeah, they needed to see this isn't their house." That's when the meltdown hit full swing. Diane spun on Alyssa, tears streaming down her face. "How could you marry someone like this?" she wailed. "He's tearing us apart." Harold stomped forward, getting in my face. "Give us the key back," he demanded, his breath hot and sour. "This is my daughter's house, and we're not going anywhere until you fix this." I didn't budge. "No," I said, my voice cold. "That key's done. You don't get another one." Harold's eyes bulged, and for a second, I thought he might swing at me. Ray stood up then, slow and deliberate, his bulk filling the room. "You heard him," he said, his tone low and dangerous. "Time to go." Diane sobbed louder, clutching Alyssa's shoulder. "Say something," she begged. "Tell him he's wrong." Alyssa looked at me, then at them, her face pale. I didn't know they'd come in like that," she stammered. "But you didn't have to do this, did you? Lock them in." I felt a pang in my chest, seeing her torn like that. But I didn't soften. "They crossed a line," I said. "I had to show them we're serious." Harold laughed, a bitter, ugly sound. "Serious? You're a joke. Hiding behind this thug." He jerked his head at Ray, who just smirked. "Next time," Ray said, stepping closer, "I won't be so nice about it." Alyssa pulled away from Diane, rubbing her temples. "Stop it, all of you," she said, her voice breaking. "Just stop." Diane glared at me, wiping her face. "This isn't over," she hissed, grabbing Harold's arm. "You'll see." They stormed out again, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. Alyssa sank onto the couch, staring at the floor. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, quiet now. I sat beside her, wanting to touch her but holding back. "I didn't want you to feel stuck in the middle," I said. "But they left me no choice." She didn't look up, just nodded, and the silence stretched out. Ray grabbed his beer and headed for the basement, muttering, "I'll let you two sort this out." I watched him go, feeling the weight of it all settle on me. They'd lost this round, but Diane's words stuck with me. This wasn't over, not even close. I woke up the next morning to an empty bed, the sheets cold where Alyssa should have been. My stomach twisted as I rolled over, squinting at the clock, 6:43 a.m., too early for her to be up, especially after last night. I stumbled out of bed, pulling on a shirt, and found her in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a mug of coffee she hadn't touched. Her eyes were red, her hair tangled, like she'd been up for hours. "Hey," I said, keeping my voice soft as I slid into the chair across from her. "You okay?" She didn't look at me, just stared at the mug. "I don't know," she said finally, her voice small. "I keep thinking about Mom and Dad, how mad they were. How you locked them in." I reached for her hand, but she pulled it back, wrapping it around the mug instead. "I had to," I said, trying to keep the frustration out of my tone. "They can't just walk in here like that." She nodded, slow, but didn't say anything else, and that silence hung heavy between us. The day dragged on like that, quiet, tense, both of us tiptoeing around what happened. I wanted to fix it, to make her see why I'd done it, but every time I opened my mouth, I saw that look in her eyes, the one that said she wasn't ready to hear it. So I kept busy, tinkering with the truck in the garage, checking the cameras even though I knew her parents wouldn't dare show up again so soon. Ray stayed out of the way, crashing in the basement, giving us space. I figured they'd lick their wounds for a while, maybe back off after the embarrassment of getting caught. I was wrong. Around noon, my phone rang, and I saw the landlord's name flash on the screen. My gut told me this wasn't a check-in call. "Hey, Mike," I answered, wiping grease off my hands with a rag. "What's up?" His voice came through, gruff and a little annoyed. Got a weird call this morning, he said. Your wife's parents, Diane and Harold, right? They offered to pay out the rest of your lease. Said they'd cover the full year if I'd end your tenancy and let them take over the house instead. I froze, the rag slipping from my hand. They what? I asked, my voice low, like I hadn't heard right. Mike sighed. Yeah. Said they're worried about Alyssa, that you're not stable or something. I told them no, your rent's always on time, no issues, but I thought you should know. I gripped the phone tighter, my jaw aching from how hard I was clenching it. Thanks, Mike, I managed to say. Appreciate it. He grunted and hung up, leaving me standing there, staring at the wall. I couldn't believe it. They didn't just cross a line, they tried to erase it completely. Buying out our lease? Kicking us out of our own home? It wasn't about helping Alyssa anymore. It was a power play, pure and simple. I paced the garage, my boots scuffing the concrete, trying to wrap my head around how far they'd go. Diane and Harold weren't just meddling parents, they were playing a whole different game, one where they thought they could outmaneuver me, take control of our life like it was theirs to run. My first thought was to tell Alyssa, lay it all out and watch her realize what they were capable of. But I stopped myself. She was still shaken from last night, still caught in that tug-of-war between me and them. If I dropped this on her now, she might not believe me, or worse, she might defend them, say it was some twisted way of caring. I decided to wait. I needed her to see it for herself, to feel the weight of what they were doing without me pushing her. So I kept it to myself, shoving the anger down deep where it wouldn't show. The rest of the day, I acted normal, helped her make dinner, watched some dumb show on TV, even laughed when she spilled sauce on the counter. But inside, I was boiling. Every time I looked at her, I wondered how much she knew about them, how much she'd let slide over the years. When we went to bed, she curled up on her side, facing away from me, and I lay there, staring at the ceiling, replaying Mike's words. They tried to buy our house out from under us. It was bold, ruthless, and I had to admit, part of me was impressed they had the guts. But mostly, I was pissed. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't telling her yet, but I wasn't sitting still either. I checked the cameras again, made sure the deadbolt code was fresh, even texted Ray to keep an eye out. He replied with a thumbs up and a beer emoji, which was about as serious as he got. I didn't know what Diane and Harold would try next, but I knew they weren't done. They'd lost the key battle, got humiliated in front of us, and now they'd gone for the big move. It didn't work, but it showed me something. They weren't just annoying in-laws anymore. They were opponents, and I had to start thinking 2 steps ahead. I kissed Alyssa goodbye as she left for work, smiling like nothing was wrong, but my mind was already on the war they'd started. This was our home, our life, and I'd fight for it, even if she didn't know the half of it yet. I couldn't sit on it anymore. 3 days had passed since the landlord's call, and every hour I kept it to myself felt like a weight pressing harder on my chest. Alyssa was still quiet, still distant, but I could tell she was wrestling with what happened, her parents barging in, me locking them out, Ray looming over it all. I didn't want to pile more on her, but Diane and Harold's lease stunt was too big to ignore. They weren't just testing boundaries, they were trying to rip our life apart. I had to do something, and waiting for them to make another move wasn't an option. So I grabbed my keys, told Alyssa I was running an errand, and drove straight to their house. No plan, no backup, just me and the fire burning in my gut. Their place was a tidy little ranch-style house about 20 minutes away, all beige siding and perfectly trimmed bushes. It looked so normal, so harmless, but I knew better. I parked in the driveway, my truck's engine ticking as it cooled, and sat there for a minute, staring at the front door. Part of me wanted to turn back, let it simmer, but I was done playing defense. I climbed out, marched up the steps, and knocked hard, 3 sharp raps that echoed in the still afternoon air. The door swung open, and there was Diane, her face tightening the second she saw me. She'd been expecting Alyssa. I could tell, her eyes flicked past me, then narrowed. What do you want? She asked, her voice clipped. I didn't waste time. We need to talk, I said, stepping forward just enough to make her back up. She hesitated, then let me in, her lips pressed into a thin line. The living room smelled like lemon cleaner, everything in its place, couch pillows fluffed, coffee table spotless. Harold shuffled in from the hallway, his eyebrows shooting up when he saw me. What's this? He grunted, crossing his arms. I didn't sit, didn't soften. I got a call from the landlord, I said, watching their faces. You tried to buy out our lease. Offered to pay it off if he'd kick us out and give you the house. Diane's eyes widened, just for a split second, before she schooled her expression. Harold didn't flinch, just stared at me like I'd accused him of something trivial. So what? Harold said, shrugging. We were looking out for Alyssa. You're not exactly proving you're good for her. I felt the heat climb up my neck, but I kept my voice steady. You don't get to decide that, I said. You don't get to walk into our life and take it over because you don't like me. Diane stepped forward, her hands clasped tight. We're her parents, she said, like that explained everything. We know what's best. You locked us in, humiliated us. How are we supposed to trust you with her? I almost laughed, the absurdity of it hitting me hard. Trust me, I said. You went through our mail. You tried to steal our home. This isn't about trust, it's about control. Harold smirked then, a smug little twist of his mouth that made my fists itch. You're out of your depth, son, he said. We were just trying to help. You're the one making this a war. I took a step closer, close enough to see the veins in his neck bulge. You made it a war, I said, my voice low. The second you used that key, the second you went behind our backs to the landlord. I'm here to tell you it stops now. One more move like this, and I'll make sure you see the inside of a courtroom. Trespassing, harassment, whatever sticks. This is your last warning. Diane gasped, her hand flying to her chest. You'd sue us? She asked, her voice shaking. After everything we've done for Alyssa? I nodded, not breaking eye contact. If you keep pushing, yeah? I'll do what I have to. Harold's smirk faded, replaced by a scowl. You're bluffing, he said, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Try me, I shot back. You think I won't protect what's mine? Our home, our marriage? You're wrong. The room went quiet, the air thick with tension. Diane looked at Harold, then back at me, her mouth opening and closing like she couldn't find the words. Get out, she finally said, pointing at the door. You don't come into our house and threaten us. I didn't argue. I'd said what I needed to. I turned and walked out, the door slamming behind me as I stepped into the sunlight. My hands were shaking as I climbed into the truck, adrenaline pumping through me. I'd laid it all out, drawn the line clear as day. They could lie to themselves, pretend they were the victims, but I'd seen the truth in their faces, guilt, anger, and maybe a little fear. I drove home slow, letting the quiet settle my nerves. Alyssa was on the couch when I walked in, reading a book, and she looked up with a small smile. Aaron go okay? She asked. I nodded, forcing a grin. Yeah, just took care of something. I didn't tell her about the confrontation, not yet. She didn't need to know I'd gone toe-to-toe with her parents, not when she was still sorting out how she felt about them. But as I sank into the chair across from her, I felt lighter. I'd faced them down, made it clear I wasn't backing off. Whatever they threw at us next, I'd be ready. This was our life, and I wasn't letting them take it away, no matter how hard they tried. I thought the confrontation would buy us some peace, at least for a while. I'd stared Harold and Diane down, told them straight up what would happen if they kept meddling, and walked away feeling like I'd finally gotten through to them. For a few days, it seemed to work. The house was quiet, the cameras stayed silent, and Alyssa started talking to me again. Not just small talk, but real conversations, like the tension from that night with her parents was finally easing up. We cooked dinner together, laughed about dumb stuff on TV, even sat on the couch holding hands like we used to. I let myself believe they'd backed off, that they'd realized they couldn't bully their way into our life. But I should have known better. People like them don't quit. They just change tactics. It started small. A couple packages we'd ordered, some books for Alyssa, a new wrench set for me, never showed up. The tracking said delivered, but the porch was empty. I figured it was a mix-up, maybe a porch pirate in the neighborhood, so I shrugged it off and ordered replacements. Then, 2 nights later, I took the trash out and found the cans tipped over, bags ripped open, coffee grounds and leftovers scattered across the driveway. I cursed under my breath, thinking it was raccoons or a stray dog, and spent an hour cleaning it up in the dark. Alyssa watched from the window, her arms crossed, frowning like she didn't buy the animal excuse. That's weird, she said when I came inside, wiping my hands on a rag. Yeah, I muttered, weird. But I didn't say what I was starting to think, that this wasn't random. Then came the night that proved it. I was half asleep on the couch, some late-night show flickering on the TV, when a noise jolted me awake, a faint thud, like something hitting the front door. Alyssa was already in bed, so I got up, rubbing my eyes, and shuffled over to check. I flipped on the porch light and peeked through the peephole. My stomach dropped. Harold was standing there, his face red and sweaty under the glow, fumbling with the old key, the one that didn't work anymore. He jammed it into the lock, twisted it hard, then cursed when the deadbolt didn't budge. I stood there, frozen, watching him bang on the door with his fist. "Alyssa," he shouted, loud enough to wake the whole street. "Open up." I glanced out the window and saw Diane circling the house, her shadow moving past the bushes like some creepy figure in a ghost story. "Alyssa, baby, let us in," she called, her voice high and desperate. My hands curled into fists. They weren't just testing me, they were losing it. I grabbed my phone, my thumb hovering over the emergency number, but I hesitated. Part of me wanted to open the door and shove them off the porch myself, let them feel how done I was. But I knew better. This needed to end clean, with proof they couldn't wiggle out of. I hit record on the camera app instead, catching Harold's pounding, Diane's whining, every second of it. The banging got louder, and I heard Alyssa's footsteps behind me. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice thick with sleep. She came up beside me, peering out the window, and her face went pale. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Are they serious?" I nodded, keeping my eyes on Harold. "Yeah, they're serious." She grabbed my arm, her nails digging in. "What do we do?" she asked, and for the first time, I heard something new in her voice, anger, not just shock. I didn't answer right away, just dialed 911 and stepped back, letting the operator pick up. "We've got 2 people trying to break into our house," I said, calm as I could manage. "They're trespassing. We need someone here now." The cops showed up fast, 2 officers in a cruiser, lights flashing but no siren. Harold stopped banging when he saw them, his hands dropping to his sides like a kid caught stealing. Diane scurried back to the porch, her face twisting into a mask of innocence. "Officers, this is a misunderstanding," she said, her voice sweet now. "We're just checking on our daughter." Harold nodded, wiping sweat off his forehead. "We have a key," he added, holding it up like it meant something. The taller cop, a guy with a buzz cut, glanced at me as I stepped outside. "You live here?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "Me and my wife. They don't have permission to be here. That key's old, the lock's changed." I showed him the footage, Harold shouting clear as day. Alyssa came out then, wrapping her arms around herself, her eyes locked on her parents. "They're trespassing," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear. The words hung there, heavy. The cop turned to Alyssa. "You want them gone?" he asked. She hesitated, looking at me, then at them. Diane's eyes welled up, pleading, but Alyssa didn't waver long. She stepped beside me, her shoulder brushing mine, and nodded. "Yes," she said, her voice firm. "I want them gone." Harold's mouth fell open, and Diane let out a sob, but the cops didn't care. "Let's go," the buzzcut guy said, motioning them toward the car. They shuffled off, Harold muttering, Diane crying, and I watched them go, feeling Alyssa's hand slip into mine. For the first time, we were on the same side, and it felt like a win, one they couldn't take back. I stood on the porch with Alyssa, watching the cop car pull away, its taillights fading into the dark. Harold and Diane were gone, hauled off in cuffs after one last pathetic attempt to argue their way out. The night was quiet again, just the hum of crickets and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Alyssa's hand was still in mine, her grip tight, and I could feel her trembling, not from cold, but from everything that had just happened. I squeezed her hand back, trying to steady her, steady us both. "You okay?" I asked, my voice low. She didn't answer right away, just stared down the empty street where her parents had disappeared. "I don't know," she said finally, her voice shaky. "I can't believe they did that." We went inside, locking the door behind us, deadbolt and all, and sank onto the couch. The house felt different now, like it was holding its breath after the chaos. Alyssa pulled her knees up, wrapping her arms around them, and I sat close, not sure what to say. "They've never gone that far before," she said, her eyes fixed on the floor. "Showing up like that, banging on the door. It's crazy." I nodded, leaning back, my arm resting along the couch behind her. "They've been building up to it," I said. "The key, the landlord thing, they've been pushing harder every time." She looked at me then, her brow furrowing. "Landlord thing?" she asked. I cursed myself silently. I hadn't meant to let that slip. Not yet. I took a breath, figuring there was no point in holding back now. "A few days ago, Mike called," I said. "Your parents tried to buy out our lease. Offered to pay the rest of the year if he'd kick us out and give them the house." Her mouth dropped open, and for a second, she just stared at me, like the words didn't make sense. "They what?" she whispered. I nodded, keeping my tone even. "Yeah, he turned them down, but they tried. That's why I went to their place, told them to back off or I'd take it legal." Her eyes widened, and she pulled away a little, processing it. You didn't tell me, she said, not accusing, just confused. I didn't want to pile it on, I admitted. You were already dealing with enough. She didn't say anything for a long minute, just sat there, her hands twisting in her lap. Then she nodded, slow, like she was piecing it together. They're desperate, I said, leaning forward. They can't stand not being in control. Tonight was them losing it completely. Alyssa looked up at me, her eyes wet but clear. I thought they'd stop, she said. I don't know, that they'd see we're happy and let it go. I reached for her hand again, and this time she let me take it. They won't, I said. Not unless we make them. The next morning, we got an email. I was making coffee when Alyssa called me over to her laptop, her voice tight. Look at this, she said, pointing at the screen. It was from a lawyer, some guy named Richard Platt, representing Diane and Harold. The subject line read, Notice of Intent, and the message was a wall of legal jargon about alienation of familial affection, claiming we'd cut them off unfairly and demanding we resume normal communication or face a lawsuit. I read it twice, my jaw tightening with every word. Alyssa sat back, her face pale. They're serious, she said, almost to herself. They're actually doing this. I set my mug down, the coffee sloshing a little. They're bluffing, I said, though I wasn't totally sure. They've got nothing, no case, no proof. It's a scare tactic. She didn't look convinced, just kept staring at the screen. What if they don't stop? She asked. I sat beside her, pulling the laptop away. Then we fight, I said. But first, we cut them off. For good. She looked at me, hesitant, then nodded. Okay, she said. How? I grabbed a notepad and a pen. We write back, I said. Tell them to leave us alone, no contact. Done. We drafted it together, keeping it short and sharp. Do not contact us again. Any further attempts will be considered harassment. Alyssa's hand shook as she typed, but she didn't back down. We sent it, then blocked their numbers, their emails, even their social media, every way they could reach us. The days after were tense, waiting for the other shoe to drop. They tried fake numbers with voicemails we deleted, an anonymous email that went straight to spam, a Christmas card accidentally sent to the wrong address but clearly meant for us. We didn't bite. Every time, Alyssa looked at me, and I nodded. We're done, I'd say, and she'd nod back, stronger each time. It wasn't easy for her. I can see it in the way she'd pause sometimes, staring at nothing, like she was mourning something she couldn't name. But she didn't waver. One night, she came into the kitchen while I was washing dishes, leaned against the counter, and said, I think I get it now. How much they controlled me. I turned off the water, drying my hands, and looked at her. Yeah? I asked. She nodded, a small smile breaking through. Yeah, and I'm glad we stopped them. I pulled her into a hug, feeling her relax against me, and for the first time in weeks, I knew we'd made it through. They were out, and we were free, at least for now. I woke up to sunlight streaming through the bedroom window, soft and warm, the kind of morning that makes you feel like the world's giving you a fresh start. Alyssa was still asleep beside me, her breathing slow and steady, her arm draped across my chest. I lay there for a minute, just watching her, feeling the quiet settle over me like a blanket. It had been months since the night her parents showed up banging on our door, months since we cut them off and locked them out of our lives for good. The chaos they'd brought had faded, replaced by a calm I hadn't realized we'd been missing. The house felt different now, lighter, like it had finally shaken off their shadow. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake her, and padded to the kitchen to start the coffee. Standing there, waiting for the pot to brew, I thought about how far we'd come. After that lawyer's email, after we sent our reply and blocked every way they could reach us, things got easier. Not right away. Alyssa had her moments, days when she'd get quiet, staring at her phone like she was waiting for it to ring. I'd catch her looking at old photos sometimes, her parents smiling in the background, and I'd wonder if she regretted it. But she never said so. She'd just put the phone down, take a deep breath, and move on. I didn't push her to talk about it. Didn't need to. She was figuring it out, same as me, and every day she seemed a little stronger, a little more herself. The coffee maker beeped, and I poured 2 mugs, stirring sugar into hers the way she liked. Outside, the street was waking up, kids riding bikes, a neighbor mowing his lawn. I stepped onto the porch, though it cool under my bare feet, and leaned against the railing, taking it all in. This was ours now, really ours. No more waiting for Diane and Harold to show up unannounced, no more wondering what they'd try next. The cameras were still up, but I hadn't checked them in weeks. The deadbolt stayed locked, but it wasn't a shield anymore, just a habit. I sipped my coffee, feeling the warmth spread through me, and smiled. We'd fought for this, and we'd won. Alyssa came out a few minutes later, her hair messy, my old t-shirt hanging loose on her. She took the mug I handed her, wrapping her hands around it, and leaned against me. "Morning," she said, her voice still sleepy. "Morning," I replied, slipping an arm around her waist. We stood there, watching the street, not saying much. It was enough just to be together, no words needed. After a while, she set her mug down on the railing and turned to me, her eyes bright. "I feel like I can finally breathe," she said, and the way she said it, like she'd been holding it in forever, hit me hard. I pulled her closer, resting my chin on her head. "You're not alone anymore," I said, meaning every word. She laughed then, a soft, real laugh, and pulled back to look at me. "You know what? Let's invite Uncle Ray over," she said, grinning. "He deserves a beer after everything." I chuckled, picturing Ray's smug face when he heard her say that. "Yeah, he'd like that," I said. "I'll text him." She nodded, picking up her mug again, and we stayed out there a while longer, letting the day stretch out ahead of us. It felt good, planning something normal, something ours. Ray had been a rock through all this, showing up when I needed him, scaring the hell out of her parents, even sticking around after just to make sure we were okay. A beer was the least we could do. Later that afternoon, Ray rolled up in his beat-up van, the engine rumbling loud enough to turn heads. He climbed out, all tattoos and leather, and clapped me on the shoulder as he walked in. "Place looks good," he said, nodding at the living room like he was proud of it. Alyssa handed him a cold beer, and he raised it with a grin. "To you too," he said, clinking it against mine. Tough as nails. We sat around the kitchen table, talking about nothing important. His latest tattoo clients, some story about a bar fight he'd seen, the way the Broncos were playing this season. Alyssa laughed more than I'd heard in months, her shoulders loose, her smile easy. I watched her, feeling my chest swell, knowing she was finally free of them. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky orange, Ray headed out, promising to come back for a barbecue next time. Alyssa and I cleaned up, moving around each other like we'd been doing it forever. When the dishes were done, we ended up back on the porch, the street lights flickering on one by one. She leaned into me, her head on my shoulder, and I wrapped my arm around her. "This is ours," she said, quiet but sure. "Yeah," I said, kissing her hair. Finally, the night closed in, soft and peaceful, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I had to look over my shoulder. We'd made it through, and this, our home, our life, was ours to keep.